again, my name is Deb Erkes. I took a circuitous route to come to this work. And, I got my first ever exposure to a terrible sexual violence case as a new baby ombuds. I started my career in student ombuds, and at the time, there was absolutely no information out there, absolutely no guidance. And so we tended to just sort of mimic what we saw on the crime television, which was terrible. That actually continued throughout a lot of our work over the decades in our universities. So I went from ombuds, I did a little bit of human rights work. I then moved into the other side as a decision maker, as a discipline officer at the university, and then became director of student conduct and accountability. And also during that point, I worked on a national project called Courage to Act. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Just wanted to sort of frame my work. I am speaking, of course, from the Canadian perspective and using Canadian legal frameworks. So I hope some of this can travel across borders here. I know that all of our goodwill certainly does. All right. So I am going to be talking a little bit about what I'm calling the desired state. And what I mean when I say that is that we all want in our universities a safe, supportive, accessible working and learning environment, free from harassment, free from violence, so that we actually can concentrate on doing the work of the university. The problem, though, when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence, is that there's an expectation that a formal complaint, and by that I mean, full investigation, hearing with a finding, possibly discipline, is actually the only legitimate response to a disclosure of sexual violence. And that is actually counter to a trauma-informed, survivor-driven approach and harmful to both parties. It does not bring us any closer to that desired state. I've been asked to define a couple of terms because we all tend to throw around trauma-informed, survivor-centered, survivor-driven. So I'm going to do a little bit of defining here. And so starting what it means to be trauma-informed. It is not about being kinder or gentler. It's not about being more respectful. It's about understanding the effects of potential trauma on the parties involved. So trauma is absolutely not about feelings. It has nothing to do with feelings, no matter how awful those feelings might be. It's a chemical reaction in the brain that puts the body into survival mode whenever it perceives a threat to life. So what happened next and how the body reacts is 100% entirely outside of the person's control. Everyone reacts differently. Not all survivors are traumatized, and those who are may have very, very different responses. So you might be familiar with the fight, flight, freeze response. There's also a fourth one, the fawn response, the appeasing the person so that they will not hurt you. That's another common trauma response, all with the goal in the brain of avoiding death or grave injury. And so memories are also encoded differently. And mostly those memories are sensory memories. So what you see, what you hear, what you feel, what you taste. And some, but not all memories are encoded entirely. So there might be, things that aren't salient to the person when they're encoding memories. They are looking at potentially, the size of a person's hand, but not the color of their eyes, right? So they're looking at the things that will, but they need to pay attention to save themselves. And this also means the higher brain functions actually shut down. So the ability to organize memories is limited. People tend to not be able to put things in a timeline when they've been traumatized. So this means investigations have to be done differently. Different questions need to be asked, or maybe in a different way. And trauma actually has to be understood in order to understand the evidence that they're collecting. It can also be reactivated. So what we mean when we say that someone is being triggered is that they're reliving the incident, and that same chemical response is happening in the brain. So the person is literally experiencing the traumatic event again. The memory is in the part of the brain that lights up when they first experienced it. It's not in the part of the brain that actually lights up with other, maybe even scary or sad memories. So it literally means the person's body is reliving that event. So when that happens, obviously it's you know, we want to do something. We can usually see signs of this happening. Someone completely withdraws from the present. They you know, stop reacting to things around them. So we want to bring them back to the present. So if you are in your office with someone who's clearly having a trauma response, it's nice to have little squeeze toys or something that you can get them to bring them back to their sensory present. Get them to count the ceiling tiles or talk about the colors they see in the room, or get them to, you know, wiggle their toes in their shoes and pay attention to what that feels like, just to let them know they are in a safe place. They are not in that dangerous place. And it just, their brain needs to be convinced of that. And we also know, of course, that sexual violence has been shown to cause trauma. So what we want to be really clear about in our understanding of trauma when it comes to sexual violence in post-secondaries is that trauma is not evidence. It's a prompt. It's telling us we need to do things differently and we need to understand things differently. Okay, so the next term I was asked to define is survivor-driven, because this is another one that can be misunderstood by survivors, by people who work in institutions. Sometimes we use the word survivor-centered, sometimes it's survivor-led. Survivor-driven processes means that we give the autonomy back to the survivors to choose for themselves. So it makes space for them to decide who to tell, what to say, what services to access, which process to engage, if any, and doing nothing is recognized as a legitimate response for survivors. And then the extent of their own participation, should the university be engaging in a process of some kind. This is putting intersectionality into action because it allows a person to make these decisions with regard to their own unique social locations, intersections, circumstances, and needs, things that we may never be able to anticipate and that they might not be able to articulate. So allowing survivors to have that space to make those choices is actually putting intersectionality into action. And you know, the way I would conceive of this is that when an experience of sexual violence takes an individual's autonomy away, our process to address it should not do the same. That self-determination, that autonomy needs to be restored in order to help that person get through and move on in their lives. So when I talk about the complaint process, I want to actually clarify that any critique I have, and you will hear that I have quite a bit of critique about our complaint processes, but they're not about the people doing the work. You don't get into this if you don't care. It's about the institutional structures and policies. And unfortunately, formal complaints continue to be viewed as the only legitimate response to a disclosure of sexual violence. So I feel like I might be preaching to the choir here, but I'm going to lay out why this will never be a supportive response, the expectation that a person has to make a formal complaint. So a disciplinary response, meaning investigation and sanction, is actually the opposite of survivor-centered, even when it's trauma-informed. It is all of the focus goes onto the respondent. And the emphasis is on the process, often without regard for the people involved. We tend to import language and assumptions from the criminal legal system. Like I was talking about as a young decision maker, I had no training. All I knew was what I saw on TV. And you can see it in our policies, you can see it in processes that has been imported from the criminal legal system. And, you know, I'll give you an example. Even when we're using a balance of probabilities or preponderance of the evidence standard, Investigators will often design their questions to try and poke holes in a complainant's account, like as if to establish reasonable doubt. And that is the criminal standard. It has no place in an administrative policy investigation, but most people don't really understand that, including our investigators. Cases are often dismissed due to a lack of evidence. And so those one said, the other said cases that are so common are handled extraordinarily poorly. Investigators and decision makers ignore the fact that the statements are evidence and need to be treated as such. And so maybe one person's statement is treated as evidence while the other person's statement is not. Very much not trauma-informed, very much not survivor-driven. And even when there is enough evidence to meet the balance of probability, standard of proof, or preponderance of the evidence, if any of you are in the States, the outcome rarely actually does anything to meet the needs of the survivor. You hear, sort of aggravating and mitigating factors about the respondent. Oh, this person's an excellent student. They have such potential. We maybe need to lower the sanction. This is not an appropriate way to approach these things. And so what this tends to look like for survivors is, it's as if we as post-secondary institutions collectively settled on what I would consider to be the third worst approach by insisting that survivors have to report their experiences. Because this is such an undesirable option, many choose to remain silent, make it through on their own without support from their institution, and that results in many of them not being successful in their student life or having to leave their employment. So this leads then to the second worst approach, I would say, for survivors, which is when we tell them that the institution is unable to do anything without them making a complaint. So we tell them, we're helpless to do anything unless they initiate it. This is absolutely not true, as Anna will tell you, and literally downloads the responsibility to keep campus safe onto survivors who did not ask to be in that position. We tell them it's their job to prevent future sexual violence. So not only do we tend to blame them for what someone else chose to do to them, we then hold them responsible for ensuring it doesn't happen to someone else. This is inconceivable. It's not their job, and it's not fair to place them in that position as a result of a choice someone else to commit violence on them. Now, some survivors do believe that it's their civic duty to report in order to prevent future violence. I'm just going to make a bold claim here. It actually doesn't, but I understand the thinking behind that. If I can stop this one person from doing this to someone else, but the reality is, a report may not do that. And it certainly won't in a context of an institution where all of these complaints are 100% confidential. It's not going to stop anyone else from doing it either. So this is one of those myths we tend to hold in our minds as universities that, oh, well, this is about prevention. It actually isn't. So this then can lead to what I would consider the absolute worst outcome for survivors. And often this is the scenario that plays out because so many complaints of sexual violence come without that hard evidence that we're looking for, because that's what we learned on TV. And so many investigators are not trauma informed. They mistake symptoms of trauma for signs of dishonesty. So a survivor goes through a grueling investigation, possibly a dehumanizing hearing, only to be told that the violence did not happen. This is downright cruel. And there are, of course, some cases in which an investigation and hearing result in a finding that the respondent was in violation. In these cases, again, as I was saying, we tend to focus only on the respondent when we are deciding on those sanctions, and those outcomes rarely do anything to meet the survivor's needs created by the violence toward them. So consider then how much worse this is for survivors for whom court-like processes are anything but safe, or for those carrying trauma from earlier life experiences. our processes, never mind the sexual violence itself, our processes can be excruciating, life-altering, worse than the incident that they were trying to address. And they themselves can have a cascading effect throughout a complainant's life and a respondent. So I've painted a bleak picture. I'm going to hand it over to Anna to give us some possible solutions.
Thank you so much, Deb. I've just been nodding like an absolute enthusiastic person throughout this because everything that you have said is very familiar to me. And I was just cheering on all of your points. And I think it's fascinating that Deb in Canada and myself in the UK, and also in touch with people, working in Ireland and other European countries. And as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from New Zealand, so I'm in touch with the New Zealand and Australian context. Across all of these contexts, a lot of people are having the same conversations and trying to figure out the same ways forward. So this is really exciting and fascinating. So what I'm going to do is give an overview of some of the ways forward that can be taken in the absence of a formal complaint. And then I'll hand back to Deb, who'll talk about how she's done this in practice. And just to introduce who we are at the 1752 Group, we're a research and campaigning organisation. So as an academic researcher, this is the kind of vehicle for making change in the world and getting our research into practice. We're called the 1752 Group after the work that we were doing, the activism when we started in 2015 at Goldsmiths, University of London, when there was a very, very entrenched culture of sexual harassment and misconduct from staff towards students. And £1,752 was the amount of money that the institution were willing to put forward to address this absolutely dire situation. So eventually the whole thing blew up in their face. Professor Sara Ahmed, who you may have heard of, resigned over this issue, and they had a lot of negative press, and they had to invest a lot more money than £1,752. So it's a reminder that sticking plaster solutions and kind of tiny gestures are not going to help with addressing what is an endemic and entrenched issue. And so we've focused particularly on staff to student sexual misconduct, which is a really challenging area for universities to address. And what Deb was talking about around survivors being told, okay, the only way that the institution can take action is on the basis of a formal report. This is precisely what happened in the Goldsmiths case. If you don't put your name to a report, we won't act. And this is something that I have heard over and over again in my research since then. But I think it's changing. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the directions. It's not going to be exhaustive. It's just a few possibilities. And I'm talking about what's at the forefront of new approaches in this area. So your institution might be quite a long way away from the types of things that I'm describing. But even if what we're talking about today isn't yet possible in your institution, maybe it's helpful to know the direction of travel and where we should be aiming to get to. So this is kind of covering what Deb's already said. And this is a report that I wrote last year, which was talking to student and staff survivors in higher education who had reported, and then talking to the staff who were handing their reports and trying to understand what was going on with formal reporting processes. So formal reporting assumes individuals are reporting other individuals, and actually we know perpetration is serial. It's likely that there are multiple people targeted, so that's just false. And as Deb said, the responsibility and the risk of carrying forward a formal report is entirely placed on the survivor. So we're trying to put that back onto the institution. So I'm going to put this in the context of some new legislation and guidance in the UK context where I'm working. But I'm using this as a kind of this is not UK specific, I think. There's also similar work in Australia around preventing sexual harassment. And I think this is the direction of travel more generally. And I also want to say, so this is some new guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission in the UK, and this came in only last month, so it's very fresh off the press. And I wanted to say something about our engagement to try and get this guidance implemented. So the legislation was passed last year to say that employers, so this is only relating to staff, not students, employers have a legal duty to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. This is a big shift from just responding to preventing. And then the guidance for the new duty, the draft guidance came out in the summer. Now, those of us working in this space were extremely disappointed at this new draft guidance because it was very weak and we thought it would make no difference when published. So myself and other activists and organisations in this area, several of us sent in responses to the government consultation, and I wrote 5,000 words, I think, told them what they needed to do, and my colleagues did similarly. And when the final version of the guidance was published in September, it was absolutely transformed, and it was much better. And so I wanted to give that example because I don't know about you, but it might feel that sometimes it's not worth engaging with these change processes, engaging with government, particularly, when there's so many fires to fight on so many different angles, and we might think it's not worth it. And so this is an example of when it really, really was worth it. And some of the specific examples I used in my response were taken up and now in national legal guidance. So it is worth doing this kind of national level campaigning if you have the energy or time. And so we're going to use this as a campaigning tool to try and get organisations to comply. So I'm going to highlight some of the points in this guidance. Obviously, it's only applicable in the UK, but you can potentially use it in your context to say, okay, well, if they're doing this in the UK, we can do this here. Similar, some legislation is in place across the UK and Europe. So data protection and GDPR, which I know is also an issue in Canada, has been a real sticking point here. So if that's, this is GDPR compliant guidance as well. So the first one, I'm going to go through 4 points quickly. Don't wait for a formal report to investigate. We're going to talk about using data and documenting disclosures. I'll talk about risk assessments, and I'll talk about how to avoid passing a harasser between institutions. And I'll just get through all of these fairly briefly, so we've got time for discussion. So this is going to be my slogan for the next 5 years, I can imagine. The guidance states that if sexual harassment has taken place, an employer or a university should take action to stop it happening again. So when we talk about preventing sexual harassment or gender-based violence, we often think about preventing it before it occurs in the first place. And I'm going to talk about that as well, because that's very important. But actually, just as important, or even more important, prevention is about stopping it from happening again. So we know that a large amount of gender-based violence is serial. We've got data from students that shows that male perpetrators are likely to be repeat predators. And for staff as well, we know that the norm is for staff to target multiple students and staff, either at the same time or over a period of time. I think from my research, the most stark example was a professor who was sending copying and pasting the same sexualized messages to about 30 different women, staff, students, and others, both in his university and in others. So, and this was over a period of several years, as far as we know. So there's a lot that you can do once you find out as an institution that sexual harassment is taking place. There's a lot you can do to stop it. I'm going to get this slogan on a t-shirt or on a mug or something, because I feel like it just needs to be repeated over and over and over again. So the focus on prevention should kick in as soon as the institution becomes aware that sexual harassment has occurred. Okay, so how do institutions receive this information? So how do you find out that it's occurring? You do not wait for a formal report, because very few people will actually take up this option. So more and more universities now do have anonymous reporting systems. And to be clear, usually you can't investigate an anonymous report. Occasionally there may be enough evidence submitted with that, such as CCTV, photographic evidence, other evidence, but usually you can't make findings on an anonymous report. So the purpose of these is to gather high-level data about what's occurring in the institution, to make sure survivors are receiving support, and to highlight where there are issues in one part of the institution, a particular research group or department. So if your institution has this in place, it can take a few years to kind of build up enough reports to get useful data. So I've worked with institutions who've said, oh, we've had the system for 2 years and we just don't have any reports. 2 years is actually not enough time. It does take longer than that, so you've got to stick with it. And then over time, hopefully that will come into place, come into effect. The most common, perhaps, for actually formal knowledge from the institution is disclosures where the reporting party doesn't want to make a formal report. And why would they want to make this? So I would say there's probably 10, from the data I've got, easily 10 times as many disclosures as there are formal reports. So there's a lot of really helpful data, both for prevention and for understanding what's going on in the institution here. In academia, there's also a lot of rumours or whisper network, even sort of stuff coming out on social media. I've heard a lot about communications teams getting involved and responding to disclosures on social media, which usually goes very badly wrong. So you need to get specialist sexual violence, gender-based violence people involved when this happens. But this knowledge is known, and it can come to the attention of people in the institution this way. And then often you get disclosures from friends or family of the person or people targeted. And so we really need policies to be explicit about when or whether third-party reports can be investigated. Sorry, that should have come up at the start. So there's loads and loads of ways that, and I'm sure there'll be more ways that you can think of that you have received the information in this way. So we have to do something with this information. We have to have systems in place to, if it's appropriate to take formal action, to investigate in the absence of a formal report. So just to be clear, I don't think that formal investigations and disciplinary processes are going to be appropriate in many cases. But particularly because my work's been on staff and faculty who perpetrate harassment and abuse, if it's a case involving staff, I think it's usually, or it's likely to be the case where there probably will need to be some kind of formal report, formal action. So back in 2020, we published a briefing note on what we called proactive investigations, saying that the university should, if it gets information through any of these sources, actually appoint an investigator and try and gather evidence from other sources. Just today I was hearing about a situation where there were, lots and lots of witnesses who are aware of a situation, who could have given evidence if anybody had actually asked them, whereas the person at the centre wasn't going to report. So there might be evidence available if somebody actually goes to look for it. And I'm pleased to say that in the UK, University of Cambridge have now incorporated this in their dignity, it's called the Dignity at Work policy. I've got the title slightly wrong there. And they've incorporated something about what they call university instigated investigations. The policy is available online, so you can copy and paste the paragraph and try and get it into your own institutional policies, which I would recommend. And it says, where a head of institution has become aware of multiple concerns or complaints of inappropriate behaviour in their area, which may not have been formally reported, but give rise to sufficient cause for concern, they may choose to conduct an investigation to understand the alleged behaviours in more detail and to determine if support and interventions are needed, and if the findings indicate this may lead to a disciplinary process. So having this in the policy, it firstly sends a message to survivors who are looking at this policy wondering what to do, and it also gives an institutional lever to take action. I'm not saying it's going to solve all your problems, but this would be a starting point. Getting this kind of paragraph into a policy is a starting point for thinking about how to move in this direction. I won't go into any more detail about this process just now because we could talk about that the whole day, but I wanted to flag this up as an important step. But also, if there is a formal process, or even if there isn't, one of the most useful things that survivors have told me that has been put in place as part of the institutional response, the formal response, is what we call precautionary or interim measures. So these are safety measures that are put in place usually during a formal reporting process to keep the reporting party safe and to make sure they don't experience any further harm or victimization or retaliation. Yeah, and so often the formal reporting process, as Deb said, is traumatizing for the person reporting. And this might be the best thing that they get out of it because, maybe the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator has been told to stay away from them and not contact them during this period. And so they feel safe for a while. So we need to move towards a system where it's possible to at least have voluntary agreements around these kind of safety measures as a standard offer, regardless of whether a formal report is made. And more institutions are now doing this. You may be aware of this book by Clarissa Humphreys and Graham Towell. They've got some helpful material giving an overview of this. And I should say there's a new edition of the book coming early 2025. So watch out for that because it's got some revised material on precautionary measures. And when you're looking at staff to student issues, particularly for postgraduate research students who might be working with their supervisor or might be trying to build academic careers, there's particular measures that need to be thought about. So we've written a briefing note to think about what that might look like. Okay, I'm going to move quickly along because I've got loads to say, don't I? So we've talked a little bit about anonymous reports and using the data from this. So there's one of the tools that can be used for anonymous reporting is that's used widely in the UK is called Report and Support. And so this allows people to either make anonymous or named reports and get support. And it's also a way that you can log disclosures. So a staff member or who receives a disclosure can also record this. And so this is really, really helpful because you've then got data that you can review, maybe at faculty level or maybe at institution level periodically. I think I've actually said what I need to say about this. It can take a while for this to become embedded. The number of reports you get will depend on how much people trust the system and trust the institution. So you've got to do a lot of work to kind of build trust and raise awareness. And also something that's come up in the UK is that these systems have only been available to students, not to staff. That's because some universities have been concerned that by allowing staff to anonymously report, it breaches GDPR, for example, if they give the name of a person who has harmed them. The good news is the new guidance in the UK from the Equality and Human Rights Commission states that you should be implementing such systems, and it is fine to use these for staff. So so don't worry about GDPR is my take-home message here. Okay, moving on. My third point is to carry out risk assessments to identify high-risk areas for sexual harassment and gender-based violence occurring. So risk assessments can refer to two things. They can refer to risk assessments after receiving a disclosure, which is about putting in place safety measures and figuring out what risks there are to the reporting party or to other students and staff, and as well as the responding party. But here we're actually talking about risk assessments before any sexual harassment or gender-based violence has taken place. So this is moving towards a more kind of health and safety approach, looking at the wider environment for risks, such as the presence of alcohol, lone working or pair working. And I always laugh when I say this, looking for power imbalances, because power imbalances are a risk factor for sexual harassment and gender-based violence. And of course, for us working in higher education, the power imbalances are very deeply entrenched and very kind of very stark. So looking for power imbalances as a risk factor, you're going to kind of flag up the entire institution in red, aren't you? But that's actually one of the kind of consistent and key pieces of advice around preventing sexual harassment. Um, so, so this move towards a health and safety approach is is a kind of an international shift. There's a motion that was passed by the International Labour Organization in 2019 that's been ratified by a bunch of countries, including the UK and quite a few European countries, to say that they endorse this approach, saying that addressing gender-based violence in the workplace, and that would include for students, is part of a health and safety approach. So health and safety legislation covers this area. We're at the early stages of thinking about what that looks like. But luckily, and as a New Zealander, the Australians are my, rivals stroke enemies, but I have to say the Australians are doing a great job here. If you need some resources to help think about how to implement this, the Safe Work Australia is their health and safety organisation, and Respect at Work is the gender-based violence at work framework. So actually we can borrow and adapt these frameworks for use ourselves. Okay, and then high risk areas. I mentioned power imbalances of the high risk area. One of these, of course, particularly for staff to student, is staff to student supervisor relationships. And so a preventative step that you can take to address this power imbalance is to bring in a staff-student personal relationship policy where you prohibit such relationships. And on the 1752 group, we've got a resource that can help with this. We've been working with the Academic Staff Union, which is called UCU, or the Universities and Colleges Union, because we figure if we can get the Academic Staff Union on board to say they support a move to ban sexual and romantic or intimate relationships between staff and students, then it's much more likely to be successful at getting it through the institution. And so this is a really, really important preventative step in general. And I should say that when we started doing this work 8 years ago, nobody was on board, or very few people were on board with prohibiting staff to student intimate relationships. And 8 years on, we're at a stage where the national regulator is talking about it, and where quite a few institutions have introduced such a policy. So we've seen this sea change. So if in your context, this is not kind of on the agenda yet, or not something that people are willing to discuss, keep pushing, because you will get there, I think. And then the final point that I want to talk about is avoiding pass the harasser. And again, this is specifically relating to staff or faculty. I found in my research that the most common outcome during a formal investigation for staff was for the faculty member or the staff member to leave that institution and move jobs, move to a different institution. And somehow they were able to do this mostly with impunity. This is still going on. So we've got to do better in our referencing, in our hiring processes, to do safe hiring and to try and find out and get this information about whether there are ongoing or upheld disciplinary cases for sexual harassment or gender-based violence. And the great thing is there's a ready-made international scheme that's free for universities to join called the Misconduct Disclosure Scheme. So we have a campaign which is covered in Nature this year, which is trying to get universities around the world to sign up to this. We've got a briefing note online which covers the GDPR-related issues. And basically, it's very simple. All the university will pledge to do is to ask people when they're hiring, to ask previous employers 2 questions about ongoing and upheld disciplinary investigations for sexual misconduct. And then once they have that information, they can choose what to do with it. They can choose to go ahead and hire that person, but at least you know, and you can put in place some preventative strategies. And then you also commit to providing that information to others when they hire them. Okay, I've got some other actions and things I was going to mention, but I think what I'll do is I'll pass over to Deb, because I really want to hear about how she's doing some of this work in practice. Does that sound okay, Deb?
I am so excited, Anna, about what you just said, because I've written white papers on a bunch of those topics as well, and I cannot wait to read your stuff.
Oh, amazing. We'll have to swap resources after. That sounds great.
Yeah, we will have to connect. Okay, let's see if I can get this going. All right, so in 2022, my university, University of Alberta, was able to make some pretty radical changes to its strategy and approach to sexual and gender-based violence. And there were a constellation of factors that allowed this to happen. We moved quickly because we had to. And in fact, the way the planets lined up, it was really, we took advantage of a very rare moment in time and were able to move quickly. So what happened was we're governed by provincial government. The universities are governed by provincial mandates. And so our provincial government issued a directive in 2022 for every university to update and modernize all of their sexual and gender-based violence policies and procedures to make them trauma-informed and survivor-centered. Now, think about this. We have a very conservative government. This was an interesting moment. And so I'll talk about sort of how that happened as well. But we also had our Board of Governors ordered an audit of the way we manage sexual violence because there were enough complaints from students about our processes that it was getting to the point where they're like, okay, we better look into this. So that happened at the same time. Then we had the National Courage to Act project, which, gave us tools about how to make the changes. So that was a very fortuitous timing. And then at my university, my position was created and we were able to, I could work full time on this, which is also quite rare, I would say. But because all of these things converged, we needed someone to be able to put all their time into it. So we were able to act quite quickly. So this was the result of literally decades of hard work and advocacy, mostly by students. So our student organizations have very good connections to our government, probably better than most of us who work in the university. And so they organized and mobilized to make changes within their institutions. And when that was unsatisfactory, as it tends to be, they began lobbying the government for levers of change. And what they were asking for was actually legislation. The government resisted that and sent us a directive instead via a letter to all the boards of governors. We also had data to show that the numbers of reports, because that's the only number they ever want, is those formal reports of sexual violence, had not significantly changed despite decades of implementing this complaint-based approach. So clearly, the punitive approach is both underutilized and ineffective in terms of prevention. And so that was something we had decades of data to show this isn't changing anything. And while frontline people see harm on an individual level, those with the budgetary access and the institutional authority only see institutional risk. So unfortunately, those individual stories of harm where we find them heartbreaking are not persuasive when there are literally hundreds of competing priorities for those dollars. And when there is typically the risk folks were saying, well, we can't talk about sexual violence because then we're the sexual violence university. When in fact, we have to talk about sexual violence because we cannot solve it without doing that. So we have to make the case that the status quo represents significant legal and reputational risk. And then finally, doing that, we might be able to persuade those with decision-making power and budgetary access that is time for a change in approach. So this is really about laying the groundwork for a better way, right? So before we ever have a survivor in front of us seeking support, we actually have to build these systems and structures that enable and foster and empower the kinds of strategies we've been talking about. And we actually, I want to make the point that Anna was raising. It's like we should apply these same principles to all forms of interpersonal harm. First of all, racism, bullying, workplace harassment, any garden variety harassment, assault, etc., and apply them to the entire community: students, staff, faculty. So I made a little. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have changed the slide there. So this is how we made it possible. It was like making sure that we had lots of levels of action, and we want to make sure also that we put in place sort of specific things. So I did create a little to-do list here. And the first thing is actually to challenge that status quo, to make it clear that what we're doing isn't working, because most institutions, they're very conservative, resistant to change, risk averse, focused on the legal, reputational, financial side of things. So we have to make the case that all of those are in play in the context of campus and or workplace sexual violence. That is, they come from a perspective of, if it isn't catastrophically broken, we should not be touching it. And we need to make the case that, in fact, it is catastrophically broken. And so, while discussions of treating people with dignity and care play nicely with the, sort of reputational stuff, unfortunately, they don't pierce the armor of institutional risk. So the key principle here is that continued reliance on formal complaint processes as the sole legitimate response to disclosure brings institutional risk. We also want to partner, because all of this work was based on years, decades of advocacy. We want to partner with those folks who have the data that we need to gather. So student advocates, community organizations, and we absolutely do want to be in contact with our governments, because when those doors start to open, like Anna said, we want to be involved and be able to influence what that looks like. So I will say, when our provincial government started making noise about having a checklist of things that they wanted to see in our policies, a group of us went to the government and said, can we please look at this checklist? Let me talk to you about some of the things on this list that might cause more harm than good. And we did manage to influence, to some extent, what was on the checklist, what wasn't. We also have to build trust with survivors. Survivors can also buy into those myths and misconceptions around sexual violence, and they may believe that reporting to the police or the institution is necessary because it's widely considered so. They might, be getting pressure from their family or friends, or even just internal pressure to report. So we have significant trust building to do with them in terms of explaining the options that are available to them, letting them know what the implications of those things are, being really transparent about what happens in a complaint process, and allowing them to make that choice. But we have to do this trust building with caution, because over promising and under delivering will feel like just another form of institutional betrayal. We cannot promise what we can't do yet. So we can talk about, here are the things we aspire to get to, but here's where we are in time. When a student comes forward, or a staff or faculty member comes forward with a disclosure and needs to know, what do I do? How can I get help? We don't want to promise things that we can't give them. This is also the time to build capacity. Even before all of these changes are made at a university, these new ways of thinking about and doing these things requires serious effort. And that means we have to take advantage of new opportunities as they arise. Doors will open, and we have to sneak through before they close. We have to structure our roles in our offices to bring about that desired state. We have to make sure our staff is trained and ready when these things finally do come up, when these opportunities do come up. And we also have to bolster our supports for survivors and partner with community organizations if necessary. Like, if we don't have internal resources, how can we make sure our students are supported by their community? This all takes lots of time, and I made the point, 2 years is nothing. It takes a lot of time and institutional support, including money. This is not cheap. And that's why we have to make that case for risk. Like, if you don't put the money in up front, you're gonna pay it out at the backside. So I think that's something that we really do have to keep in mind as we're working with our universities. We do have to sort of work deliberately. Progress is very, very slow. It's not linear. So it's really important not to get lost in the weeds and to keep our eyes on that desired state. Never lose sight of that, but be patient. Always And this one I learned early on, and it has served me really well. Always start with the presumption of goodwill. Even where there's significant resistance to what you're trying to do, we know that nobody wants an environment that allows gender-based violence to occur. And we might disagree on how we get to that desired state, but we're all trying to do the same thing. And to recognize the good in people gets you very, very far. So find common ground. Don't preach at people. They don't like that. And, you know, we need to keep the faith. We're playing the long game. We're looking 5, 10, 15, 20 years into the future. Sometimes, like in 2022 for my institution, there will be leaps and bounds. Other times we'll be stalled or even have to backtrack, and it's really frustrating. But knowing that, you know, you can look at the progress so far, and we can see that there has been significant progress so far. So don't give up when things go backwards a little bit. And it may feel really small, but even getting to the point where your community starts by believing rather than questioning survivors, for them is a massive change. It's a massive change. So what feels little to us might make all the difference in the world to our survivors. So I want to take us back to this desired state. You know, this approach puts the responsibility for that desired state, like a safe, supportive, accessible working and learning environment, free from harassment and violence, back where it belongs, and that is onto the institution. So on receiving information about sexual or gender-based violence, an institution has the obligation to act. We need to expand our conception of what that means. And as Anna has so eloquently articulated, it's far more than just a formal complaint. There are so many things we can do. And the institution can draw on a really wide array of tools to reach that desired state, including things that have nothing to do with a specific incident, right? Training, education, awareness. We could think about restorative or transformative practices, structural or physical changes to the environment to reduce the likelihood, changes to protocols and practices, supports and preventative measures for the disclosure, all of this without having to launch an investigation and prove that the violence actually happened. So we don't need to do that in order to prevent future violence. Or we don't need to know, what we do need to do is address the factors that allowed or might allow the violence to happen. And we can use existing tools, we can customize them for our own context, or we can create our own tools. So speaking of tools, I just wanted to talk a minute about the comprehensive guide to campus gender-based violence complaints that I'm a co-author of this through Courage to Act. All of this doesn't mean that we're going to do away with complaints. They are the one mechanism we have to apply sanctions to an individual or discipline. But when we do administer a complaint, we should do our best to make sure it's trauma-informed and conducted in a manner that causes the least possible harm. So this guide actually traces a complaint from, you know, disclosure all the way through appeal, with strategies to make it trauma-informed and survivor-driven and, you know, reduce harm throughout. Paradoxically, this guide also tries to make the case throughout that complaints are not the best way to deal with most cases, and that we should be looking for other ways to address sexual and gender-based violence. Some other resources, the first two are Courage to Act. The Courage to Act, generally, there are dozens, literally dozens of tools on that website, including the white papers I was just talking about that I wrote on the same topics that Anna was bringing up. But you know, a workbook on understanding how do we think about or conceive and structure for alternative responses to sexual and gender-based violence. And then the last few are just some video tutorials that I made for my own staff training, thought they might be helpful, useful. And so I will leave it at that, and I'm happy to get into a discussion.